No one ever thinks dessert could change the course of a kingdom. But if you rewind the hands of time back to the early 16th century, when kings were fat with power and ambition was always served warm, you'll stumble into a story where a single sweet, flaky, golden pastry helped seduce a monarch, shattered a marriage, rewrote the laws of religion, and put one girl's head on a chopping block. It wasn't war that did it. Not poison. Not politics. It was a pastry. A little tart called the Maid of Honour, deceptively delicate, suspiciously sweet, and, as it turns out, dangerously irresistible. Because in the court of Henry VIII, where silence had weight and glances could kill, that cake became more than food. It became a symbol of the forbidden, a whisper in the dark, a weapon tucked in napkins between women who were queens and women who would never be. It started, innocently enough, in the hands of Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish-born queen, who was trying to hold together her marriage and her pride, while age and childlessness chipped away at her crown. In her private quarters, she surrounded herself with ladies well-bred, well-mannered, and well-watched. They weren't just companions. They were chess pieces in the most dangerous game in England. One of them was Anne Boleyn. Young, sharp, daring, too clever for her own good, too charming for Catherine's comfort. Anne watched everything. She watched the queen pray. She watched the king glance elsewhere. She watched the servants bring in a tray of sweets, and she watched as Henry took a bite of that one particular tart, stopped, smiled, and asked, "What is this?" The Maid of Honour was supposedly created by one of Catherine's Spanish pastry chefs, a concoction of cottage cheese, lemon zest, sugar, and dried currants tucked inside puff pastry, then lightly spiced with nutmeg and almond. Sounds harmless, tastes heavenly, but in that moment, it was more than just a snack. It was a moment of contact, of intimacy. Henry was a man of appetite: beef, wine, women, grandeur. But this was subtle. A taste that lingered, a sweetness that didn't shout, just whispered. And behind that whisper stood a girl in waiting with dark eyes and a mind already planning. Anne didn't bake it herself, but rumor had it that she was the one who passed it to the king, or smiled when he asked for another, or made a comment about how much she loved the recipe. That was all it took. In a court where a raised eyebrow could cause suspicion, a shared dessert was practically a proposal. Henry began to crave the tart. Then the girl. He asked for the recipe, then for her company, then for something the queen could no longer give him: sons. By the year 1526, Henry had started looking for an annulment. He told the world it was about religion, about Leviticus, about the sin of marrying his brother's widow. But those close to court knew the truth. It wasn't scripture he was obsessed with. It was Anne. And every time he tasted that pastry, warm and delicate and laced with spice, he remembered her, the way she spoke, her refusal to be just another mistress, the maddening way she made him chase. Every bite was a reminder of what he didn't yet have, and the throne itself began to shift. The name Maid of Honour was no accident. It was a nod to the ladies in waiting who, while standing beside queens, often found themselves caught in the king's gaze. They were ornamental, yes, but also political, and Anne knew how to play that game better than anyone. By the time she wore yellow in public, and people whispered that Catherine had been set aside, the Maid of Honour had become infamous. It was sold in Richmond. It was copied in kitchens. It became part of Tudor gossip, a baked symbol of betrayal and flirtation. And the queen, who had once shared it with her ladies, She was alone now, without her crown, without her husband, without her dignity. As for Henry, he never stopped indulging. His body grew large. His mobility shrank. Some say it was the jousting accident in 1536 that crippled him. Others blame the endless feasting. Beef by the pound, pies the size of helmets. But somewhere in that mix, always, was the dessert, a little tart filled with dairy and dried fruit, sweetened just enough to feel innocent, but heavy with consequence. The irony, of course, is that Anne Boleyn, after years of seduction, after breaking a marriage, after giving Henry a daughter, but not the son he so desperately wanted, would one day find herself facing execution. May of 1536. The Tower, the sword from Calais, and when her head fell, the court was silent. The kitchens were silent. The ovens cooled. No one baked that day. But the recipe survived, scribbled in margins, passed down in whispers, brought back centuries later by curious cooks and amateur historians. Today, people try to recreate it, with measuring cups and cupcake tins, with cottage cheese that smells off and puff pastry that sticks. Some succeed, some fail, but none of them know what it really meant. That in the reign of Henry VIII, even a dessert could be dangerous. Even a tart could be fatal. And even a maid of honor could become a queen just long enough to lose her head. So next time you taste something sweet, ask yourself, what are you really biting into? A recipe, a romance, or a revolution? In the early morning hush of a winter day, long before the halls of Hampton Court came alive with footsteps and schemes, there was the quiet shuffle of linen skirts, the soft clink of pewter trays, and the comforting hum of women speaking in low, familiar tones, in a chamber tucked behind the Queen's private gallery. The scent of lemon peel and warm milk drifted from a modest kitchen hearth, not the grand kitchens where roasted swans and venison pies were prepared for royal feasts. Would a quieter place, a gentler space, where the women of Catherine of Aragon's household prepared little comforts not for kings, but for each other. The apron was damp, stained with curds and specks of flour, tied too tightly around the waist of a young woman who hadn't yet learned how to move through court life without clumsiness. Her name was Jane, or Mary, or perhaps Elizabeth, names repeated so often among the ladies that they seemed to merge, their identities blurred beneath coifs and curtsies. But this girl, whatever her name truly was, had strong hands and a nervous laugh. And she worked the ingredients like she'd done 100 times before cheese sieved through linen. Currants picked clean. Lemon zest scraped so thin, it curled like ribbons. The copper bowl beneath her elbow warmed slightly from the heat of the fire. And above it, a shadow past Anne Boleyn. Not yet a queen. Not yet a scandal. Just another lady in waiting with sharp eyes and a mind full of untold thoughts. Anne didn't speak often in that kitchen. She watched. She observed the way the girls helped one another. The way they offered a kind of closeness that had nothing to do with ambition. In those walls, there was no room for envy. No room for games. There was only the rhythm of hands and the repetition of remembered recipes passed down not in books, but in costures, pinches, folds, glances, when to stir and when to wait, how to knead without bruising the dough, and how, when the Queen herself came in quietly through the side door, they all stood a little straighter and pretended not to notice the sadness she carried like a second gown. Catherine of Aragon was not old then, though the English liked to pretend she was. Her beauty had faded, not from age but from sorrow. The years had taken more than her youth, They had taken sons, sisters, allies, and now, though no one dared say it aloud, they were beginning to take her husband, too. She smiled when she saw the bowls, the pastry, the scent of almond in the air. It reminded her of Spain, of Toledo, of her mother's kitchens, of a life before politics and miscarriages and English winters. She nodded once, then reached out and tasted the edge of the dough. Her eyes fluttered closed, and for that moment, she was not a queen. She was a girl again, safe in a world where sweetness still held power. "I think," she said gently, "we should fill them only halfway. Let the filling rise slowly." As it did in Seville, the girls nodded, pretending they had planned to do just that. And someone reached for the smaller spoon. Anne, standing near the window, and said nothing. But she watched Catherine carefully, and she stored away the queen's words the same way she stored court gossip, not for cruelty, but for survival. She understood the power of memory. She knew that even queens had kitchens and favorite dishes and moments of aching silence, and in that knowledge, she found something soft, something human beneath all the stiffness of etiquette and hierarchy. The baking tins they used were not quite right. There were no proper patty pans, just round molds borrowed from the apothecary's supply of wax salves and scented balms. The dough didn't quite fit, so they pressed and folded until it looked passable. The filling pale, speckled with currants and almonds, spiced with nutmeg that was hoarded, like treasure was poured with cautious fingers. No one dared waste it. Ingredients were precious, even in a palace. Nothing came without cost. As the first batch went into the brick oven, the room filled with warmth, and the girls relaxed just enough to laugh. Not loudly, not inappropriately, but the kind of laughter that can only come when something smells good and no one important is watching. Someone, probably that same girl with the stained apron, made a comment about how the king would eat anything with sugar in it, even a boot, if you dipped it in honey. They giggled. Anne smiled. Catherine, too, allowed herself a small breath of amusement. For just one morning, everything outside that room seemed far away. But court life never stayed quiet for long. By the time the second batch was ready for the oven, there was a knock at the outer door, not the sharp rap of authority, but the hesitant knock of someone who didn't belong. One of the pages, cheeks flushed and hair wild from running, poked his head inside and whispered something to Catherine. Her face changed, not visibly, but deeply. Her body stilled. Her breath slowed. The words he spoke were not for public ears, but everyone in the room could feel the chill that came in with him. She left without another word. The door shut behind her like a final note in a song no one wanted to hear again. Anne turned then, her face still lit by the fire, and picked up one of the warm pastries. She held it in her hand a moment, as though weighing its significance, and then took a small bite. She chewed slowly, eyes fixed on the embers, and said softly, more to herself than to anyone else, "It needs more spice." The girls blinked, then nodded, then returned to their work. Outside, the bells rang. Somewhere, a letter was being signed. Somewhere else, a man was being told to begin preparations. The wheel of fate turned silently, and none of the girls in that small kitchen would ever be the same. Anne Boleyn would rise, Catherine would fall, and the Maid of Honour, sweet, soft, and deceptively innocent, would be remembered not for its flavor, but for the shadows it left behind. Because in Tudor England, even recipes were political. Even baking could be an act of allegiance, and even silence, in the hands of the right woman, could shape the future of a nation. The kitchens had fallen quiet again. The fire had burned down to a slow, amber flicker, and the scent of nutmeg and warm pastry lingered like the last echo of a song long faded. Most of the girls had gone, their laughter tucked away neatly, like folded aprons. And all that remained was the scraping of bowls and the soft hush of someone cleaning up slowly. Unwilling to leave just yet, the copper mixing bowl still sat on the wooden table, its inside speckled with traces of cheese and sugar. The spoon leaning against the edge. Forgotten. Outside, the wind curled against the stone walls of the palace. A soft and persistent reminder that even the grandest court could not keep the cold from returning. Anne Boleyn stood alone now, her shadow long and slender on the tiled floor. The others had gone to prayers or lessons or to tend to their embroidery beside the Queen. But Anne had asked to stay a little longer, claiming she wished to help tidy the kitchen. No one questioned her. No one noticed the slight tremble in her hands, or how carefully she wiped the rim of the mixing bowl, over and over, as if scrubbing away more than just remnants of batter. It was in this stillness that the door creaked open again, not the outer door, where pages entered with messages and servants with trays, but the smaller one at the far end of the room, near the old spice cupboard. It was rarely used. Half hidden behind a hanging cloth, a man stepped through it slowly, cautiously, as though unsure if he should be there at all. He was not dressed for the kitchens. His boots were polished, his collar too clean, and his eyes darted toward the firelight, already seeking the figure he knew would be waiting. They did not speak at first. Anne turned, the cloth still in her hands, and regarded him in silence. He said nothing, and in that silence, something passed between them, like the heat that radiates from a closed oven door. Familiar. Tense. Waiting. "You should not have come this way," she said at last, her voice low and flat, almost tired. "I had to see you," he replied. "Before." Anne turned back to the table. Before what she asked, though she already knew the answer. He didn't respond. Not directly. Instead, he reached toward the bowl, dragged a finger across the inside curve, where a line of sweetened cheese still clung to the metal, and tasted it absently. "It's good," he said. "Better than the ones from last month." Anne gave a soft snort of laughter, the kind that barely lifts at the corners of the mouth. "It's not the recipe that changed," she said. "It's the company." The man stepped closer, enough that she could smell the faint trace of oil and parchment on his sleeves, the scent of the council chamber clinging to him. He was not a cook, not a courtier, not even one of her suitors, at least not in the formal sense. He was something else, a whisper in corridors, a pair of eyes watching from beyond the Queen's shoulder, a voice that had once told her that the king had noticed her, and that she should be cautious. That same voice now stood beside her, uncertain, perhaps afraid, of what they had begun. "There's talk," he said quietly. "More than talk. The king is speaking to Wolsey." Anne's shoulders did not move. "He always speaks to Wolsey. He has asked about an annulment." This time she stilled, utterly. Even the cloth in her hands fell quiet. She turned her head slightly, just enough for the candlelight to catch the curve of her jaw. "He will not succeed," she said finally, her voice so soft it was nearly lost in the crackling of the fire. "Rome will not allow it." The man shook his head. "He will not wait for Rome. He is already speaking of England's independence, of breaking from the Pope, of making himself head of the church. Anne turned fully to face him now. For me, she asked. Would he do that? For me. The man did not answer. But his eyes said yes. She looked away again. Toward the mixing bowl. Toward the last remnants of the dessert that had started as a memory from Seville and become something far more dangerous in England. Her fingers touched the edge of the spoon. Then the folds of the cloth. Then the edge of the table as though grounding herself. The kitchen felt warmer. Or perhaps she had simply stepped too close to the fire. You think I should be afraid? She said after a long moment. I think you should be prepared. He said, there are some who already call you Jezebel. She almost smiled. Let them. The Bible is full of women who changed kingdoms. Many of them died for it. Her eyes flicked back to his. So did kings. He had no reply. There was another silence. Deeper this time. The kind that feels heavy. Not because of what's being said, but because of what's being left unsaid, in the flicker of that candlelit room, with the smell of sugar still lingering, and the copper bowl gleaming like a half-forgotten mirror. The future was being stitched together, not in proclamations or battles, but in glances, in whispered warnings, in the taste of something sweet that could not last. Anne moved past him then, gathering the last of the dishes into her arms, placing them near the water basin. If the king wants an heir, she said without turning, he will not find one in Catherine. He will not find peace in you. The man replied. She paused. Then, with a strange kind of serenity, she said, kings do not want peace. They want legacy. And with that, she dipped her hands into the basin and began to wash. Slowly, methodically, as if the conversation had not just changed the course of England. He left soon after, slipping through the side door as quietly as he had come. The cloth fell back into place, and the room returned to stillness. Anne remained, washing the last of the spice from the wooden spoon, her movements precise and gentle, as if she were preserving something delicate, because she was preserving herself, and the mixing bowl, still warm to the touch, sat like a silent witness to a truth. No one would ever write down that the real revolutions of history often begin not with blood, but with butter, not with swords, but with spoons, and not in thrones, but in kitchens. It was the sound of a blade against dough, soft, decisive, and without hesitation, that broke the silence of the chamber that morning. The kitchens were already warm, but the air inside that little room beyond the Queen's gallery held a different kind of heat, not the heat of fire or sugar melting into butter, but the heat of unspoken truths pressing against the walls, the kind that hums beneath the skin like a warning before a storm. Anne Boleyn stood over the long oak table with a strip of pastry spread out before her, its pale surface dusted with flour, waiting to be shaped into something more. In her hand was a small kitchen knife, worn but sharp, the handle wrapped in cloth to keep from slipping, and she wielded it not like a cook, but like someone carving out a space for herself in a world that did not yet want to make room. Her fingers moved slowly at first, then, with greater purpose, cutting neat circles into the dough, using the rim of a borrowed goblet. The Queen's patty pans had gone missing weeks before, and no one had thought to replace them. Perhaps no one wanted to. The Queen's presence had grown fainter with each passing day. Fewer visitors, fewer letters, fewer allies. Even her gowns had changed, less velvet, more linen, less crimson, more gray. She moved through the court like someone walking across ice. Careful, precise. but always at risk of falling through. And all the while, Anne had been learning the rhythm of the court's silence, how to navigate its icy surfaces, and how to use its cracks to her advantage. Catherine of Aragon watched now from the far side of the chamber, her hands folded tightly in her lap, fingers white at the knuckles. She did not speak. She simply sat in a high-backed chair near the window, wrapped in a shawl embroidered with Castilian roses, eyes fixed not on Anne's hands, but on the knife they held. There was no anger in her gaze, no pleading, just the weight of 1,000 days spent waiting for something, anything, to go back to the way it once was. Anne did not flinch beneath her stare. She did not apologize for occupying the space she now filled. The distance between them, both physical and unspoken, it had become a wall. Neither would cross, but the tension hung thick in the air, curling around the scent of pastry and ground almonds, clinging to the stone floor and the dark beams above their heads like smoke that refused to clear. "You hold the knife well," Catherine said at last, her voice low but steady. Anne looked up, her mouth tightening just slightly at the corners. "I've had practice." The Queen nodded. "Yes, I imagine you have." There was a long pause, the kind that stretched until it became uncomfortable, until it begged to be broken. But neither woman moved. The younger continued her work, lining the circles of pastry along the tin tray with perfect precision, pressing each one gently into the mold with the back of a spoon. The older remained still, watching the rhythm, the control, the confidence. "You used to be quieter," Catherine said, her eyes not leaving Anne's hands. "I used to be invisible," Anna replied. The words hung in the air, bold and unmistakable. There was no malice in them, only truth. Anne had once been just another name in a list of ladies in waiting, another face behind the Queen's shoulder, but not anymore. Now, the servants turned their heads when she passed. The men paused their conversations. Even the pages whispered. Her name was no longer an afterthought. It was a threat. The Queen exhaled slowly, her breath fogging the cold glass behind her. Outside, the gardens were bare, the branches skeletal against the winter sky. Once, she had walked those paths with Henry, laughing, arm in arm, their voices blending like music across the frost-covered hedges. Now, she walked them alone, the crunch of her boots, the only sound, her thoughts louder than any choir. "He was mine first," she said, more to the window than to Anne. "I know," Anne whispered, and for once, there was no defiance in her tone, only something that might have been sorrow. The bowl of filling sat waiting: cottage cheese, lemon zest, currants, nutmeg, and Anne scooped it slowly, deliberately, into each pastry shell, filling them just halfway, as the Queen had once instructed. The mixture trembled slightly in the spoon, but her hand remained steady. She did not spill a drop. Catherine watched, and for the first time in many months, she allowed herself to remember the days before everything had changed, before letters from Rome became more frequent than letters from her husband, before Anne's laughter began to echo in the corridors that had once belonged to her alone, before the King started asking for Spanish dishes less and less, and English sweets more and more. "He likes things simple now," she murmured, her voice distant. "He likes things sweet," Anna replied, not looking up. The Queen nodded. "He never used to. He preferred savory, meat, spice. He still does," Anne said, then paused. "But sometimes, he lets the sweet things linger longer." The words were not meant as cruelty, but in that moment, they felt like a blow. Catherine turned her face toward the window again, as if the bare trees outside offered more comfort than the warmth of the kitchen. Anne finished the last tart, smoothed the filling flat with the back of the spoon, and stepped away from the table. She wiped her hands on her apron, the cloth stained now with flecks of butter and dough, and reached for the small pot of sugar mixed with nutmeg that sat near the hearth. Carefully, she dusted each pastry with the spiced powder, as she had seen the Queen do dozens of times before. "They will bake quickly," she said quietly. 15 minutes at most." Catherine did not respond. Her reflection in the window pane was faint, the glass too cold to hold clarity, but Anne could still see her silhouette. Upright, composed, dignified, a queen in every line. Even as her power slipped through the cracks of the floor beneath her, Anne moved toward the oven, opened the heavy door, and slid the tray inside. The heat brushed her face like breath. She closed it gently, then leaned her hands against the stone, feeling the warmth soak into her skin. Behind her, Catherine stood, not loudly, not abruptly, but with the grace of a woman who had learned how to carry her dignity even when everything else was being taken from her. "You may take the recipe," she said softly. Anne turned, startled. "It was never mine to keep." The Queen continued, "My mother brought it from Spain. I gave it to my ladies. They passed it to you. That is the way of things." Unhesitated, then bowed her head. "Thank you." Catherine moved past her, toward the table. She ran her fingers along the edge of the mixing bowl, still warm, and said, almost to herself, "Even when the taste is the same, it never feels the same." "Does it no?" Anne agreed. "It never does." And for a moment, they stood in silence. Two women separated by more than age and title, bound by history, by choice, by the same man who had loved them both in such different ways, and by a dessert that neither of them would ever taste again without remembering this day. The knife still rested on the table. It had done its work, but the cutting was far from over. There are shapes that were never meant to hold what history forced inside them. Molds too shallow, edges too rigid, vessels that crack the moment you try to fill them with anything real. And in the court of Henry VIII, every woman eventually learned what it meant to be asked to fit into a shape designed by someone else, by a council, a king, a chronicler with ink-stained hands who wrote truths thinner than the parchment they were printed on. Some stories were recorded in scrolls and sermons, but others, quieter, softer, heavier, were never printed at all. They lived only in kitchens, in corners of corridors, in memories folded between layers of pastry that flaked too easily when touched. The mold Anne Boleyn used that day was not the right one. She knew it, and so did the maid, who handed it to her with a shrug and an apology. The patty pans had long since vanished, perhaps stored away by one of Catherine's loyal women, or perhaps simply lost to the slow chaos that creeps into courts where power is shifting. In their place was a tray meant for small cakes, deeper and narrower than tradition required, which meant the pastry would puff too high, or sink too low, or tear somewhere in the middle. Still, Anne said nothing. She lined the tray with what was left of the pre-rolled dough, her fingers pressing it gently into each unfamiliar curve, trying to coax something delicate into holding firm. Around here, the kitchen was dim. The fire had burned low again, as if reluctant to keep warm what it knew could not be saved. A single taper flickered near the corner where the bowl of filling waited, its scent muted now, the spices dulled by time and air. Anne stood alone. The queen had not returned. The other ladies had retreated. Even the servants moved more slowly, their steps uncertain, their glances laced with questions they did not dare ask. It was in that half-light, with her hands dusted in flour and her heart strangely quiet, that Anne thought of her sister. Mary had once stood in this very kitchen, years earlier, laughing over a bowl of cream, her cheeks flushed and her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She had been the favorite then, not of the court, not of the queen, but of the king, his first Boleyn, as some had cruelly called her, his practice run, his pleasure without promise. And when he tired of her, as he always did, she was married off with a purse and a polite farewell. Her name never entered the official records. Her story was never printed. Only Anne remembered it now. And only Anne understood how quickly favor could turn into silence. The pastries did not sit right in the tray. Anne adjusted them again. Then again. Then gave up and let them be imperfect. She spooned the filling in carefully, her mind far from the task, her thoughts trailing like steam across the cold windows. She had once believed that if she was clever enough, careful enough, beautiful enough, she could shape herself into what the king desired. But now she saw the truth, that the shape itself had always been the problem. The crown did not stretch to fit the woman. The woman was expected to shrink to fit the crown. The king had not spoken to her in 3 days. Not harshly, not coldly, but not at all. It was not the silence that frightened her. It was the stillness inside it. She placed the tray into the oven. The heat rushed out to meet her, startling against her face. She closed the door quickly, as though afraid of letting too much escape. Then she stood, hands limp at her sides, and waited. The minutes passed slowly. There was no clock to watch, only the shifting color of the flame, the soft ticking of cooling metal, and the rhythm of her breath. Inhale, hold, exhale. She did not sit. She did not speak. She did not pray. When the smell of nutmeg returned to the room, full and golden and warm, she opened the oven door and pulled the tray free. The pastries were uneven. Some had risen too much. Others had collapsed in the center. A few had cracked along the sides. The filling oozing out like secrets, too long held. Anne stared at them without blinking, then set them gently on the table to cool. She reached for the jar of sugar and nutmeg, mixed just that morning, and dusted each tart with care. They looked like they were trying to be beautiful. They looked like her. Behind her, the door creaked. She did not turn. Footsteps approached slowly, deliberate, measured, not the hesitant steps of a servant, nor the quick, clumsy gait of a page boy. These steps belonged to someone who had authority, perhaps too much of it, and who knew exactly how to wield it. Lady Anne. The voice said, smooth as oil, heavy as lead. His Majesty requests your presence. She turned slowly. The man before her wore the robes of a cleric, though not one devoted to prayer. His eyes were unreadable. His smile was fixed. Now she asked. He waits in the south gallery. Anne nodded once, then turned back to the pastries. She picked up the least damaged one, placed it on a small pewter plate, and handed it to him. For the king, she said. The man hesitated, then accepted it with a bow and departed. Anne remained where she was, surrounded by crooked molds and crumbling edges, her own reflection faint in the polished surface of the bowl beside her. No one would print this moment. No one would write about the failed batch or the kitchen that had grown too quiet. History would forget the smell of burnt pastry and the soft flour on her sleeves. It would remember the throne, the marriage, the fall. But not this. She wiped her hands on her apron. She straightened her collar. And then she walked out of the kitchen, leaving behind the molds that did not fit, and the story no one would print. The kitchen oven had no clock, no ticking hands, no brass pendulum, no measured chiming to remind its watchers when to check or when to wait. In the Tudor court, the time was kept by instinct, by the color of the fire's glow. By the way, the pastry began to breathe, its edges rising and blistering, its scent deepening from raw dough into golden promise. But instinct is a dangerous thing when the air around you no longer moves in your favor. And on that morning, the oven glowed for no one. It stood hot and ready. But no feast was planned. No queen awaited her tray of tarts. No maids gathered by the door with anxious smiles. It was simply warm and empty, and waiting for someone who would not come. Anne Boleyn had not returned to the kitchen in 2 days. The last time she had been seen, she was walking with the king beneath the frost-covered trees of the south garden, her cloak lined with fur, her voice low, her laughter rare. Rumors moved faster than footsteps in those halls. And by nightfall it was whispered she had wept just once when the king turned away without speaking. Not with cruelty, not with rage, but with something colder than both: indifference. Now, only the old cook remained by the hearth, his hands calloused from decades of stirring, his eyes dim with smoke, and knowing he had seen kings rise and queens fall, plates broken and names erased. He had served 3 monarchs and survived 4 fires. And still, he stood by the oven, as constant as the stone itself. Today, he stirred nothing. There was no meat to carve, no sauce to finish, no pastry to tend, only a half-filled jar of sugar, a bowl of dried currants left uncovered, and a silence that felt heavier than smoke. He leaned down to check the fire, poked it once, with a poker shaped like a lion's tail, then rose with a grunt and looked toward the door. It remained closed. The feast had been planned weeks before, when the king was still smiling, and the queen in waiting still glowed with hope. The table had been described in lavish detail: roasted swan, gilded trenchers, sugared fruits from Spain, and at the center, a pyramid of maids of honor, each one delicately dusted, each meant to honor the woman who had brought them to his lips for the very first time. It was to be Anne's triumph, her moment of delicate, edible victory, a feast to mark her rise. The molds had been polished, the silver warmed, the dishes chosen not for taste, but for meaning: the white pastry for purity, the lemon for sharpness, the cheese for substance, the nutmeg for danger. But now there would be no feast. The guests had been told it was postponed. Some were turned away at the gates. Others lingered in corridors, unsure whether to stay or leave. No proclamations had been made. No explanation had been given. But those who knew the court understood. A feast cancelled was never just about food. It was a message. And Anne, wherever she was, had received it before anyone else. Upstairs, the Queen's chamber was still. Catherine had not asked for the pastries either. She, too, if knew the meaning of absence. She had lived with it for years now. An absent child, an absent husband, an absent crown. She no longer walked the gardens, no longer wrote letters in the afternoon sun. She simply waited. Surrounded by books, she no longer read. Sewing, she no longer finished. Prayers, she no longer expected to be heard. The ovens meant nothing to her anymore. She had learned that sweetness never lasts. In the hallway outside the kitchen, the girl with the stained apron passed by carrying a tray that held nothing but a single empty cup. She glanced inside, her eyes drifting toward the hearth, as if searching for someone who wasn't there. Then she moved on, her footsteps soft and forgettable. No one asked her where she had come from. No one noticed when she left. Back inside, the old cook lifted the tray of pastries he had baked out of habit, half a dozen, Maids of Honour. Misshapen but fragrant, their edges browned and blistered just right. He placed them on the long wooden table, then sat beside them and said nothing. The tarts cooled slowly. Outside, the wind blew across the frostbitten courtyards. The bells of the chapel rang once, then fell silent again. There had been a time, not long ago, when these halls buzzed with expectation, when the king's affection had turned Anne's name into a weapon, her smile into prophecy, her presence into a new religion, when even the smallest crumb from her table was whispered about like relics from a holy place. But the king's heart was not built for permanence. His hunger, though vast, was never steady. What he desired today he might discard tomorrow. And Anne, for all her cleverness, had begun to realize she had built her crown on dough that crumbled too easily. Some said she had become pale. Others said she had snapped at a lady in waiting. Some claimed she had locked herself away with a letter from her father. The truth was less dramatic. She had simply gone quiet. The kind of quiet that does not beg to be broken. The kind of quiet that knows it is being watched. The old cook took one of the tarts. I bit into it slowly, chewed with care. It was not perfect. Too much lemon. The crust had split, but still, it tasted of something that used to matter. He placed the rest in a small basket, covered them with a cloth, and carried them through the empty corridor. He passed no one. The great hall was bare. The music room held no lute, no laughter, only the echo of chairs scraped across stone, once arranged for a meal that would never be eaten. He left the basket outside Anne's chamber door. He did not knock. He simply placed it down, adjusted the cloth gently, and walked away. Inside, Anne sat at her writing table, her ink dry, her paper blank. She stared at the hearth where the fire had gone out the night before and had not been relit. Her gown was simple, her hair unadorned. The mirror across from her reflected not a queen, not a mistress, not even a woman certain of who she was. Just a face, just a pair of eyes, just a breath held between before and after. She had dreamed of feasts, of tables bending beneath the weight of her power, of sugar sculptures shaped in her likeness, of being served first, of being remembered. But now, in the quiet, she realized that no feast could hold her, no banquet could keep her, no pastry could protect her from what was coming. The king had eaten, and now he was looking for something else. There were 12 tarts on the tray when it went into the oven, lined up like obedient courtiers waiting for a command, their golden dough rising slowly in the soft heat, their middles trembling with spice and cheese and old promises. But when the tray came out, only 4 of them had survived. The others had split, cracked, collapsed in on themselves like towers built on poor foundations. The filling had bubbled too high, or sunk too low. The crusts had buckled at the corners, and though no one said it aloud, the truth hung thick in the air. This was not a recipe that wanted to be remade. Not in this shape. Not in this time. Not under this ceiling where the air seemed to grow colder each time her name was spoken. The 4 surviving tarts sat neatly at the corner of the tray, barely touched by failure. Their edges clean, their centers set just enough to keep from spilling. They looked proud, as if they had endured something the others could not. But Anne did not reach for them. She sat at the edge of her bed, the tray untouched on the small table beside her, and watched the steam rise and vanish like ghosts who had come only to remind her what could no longer be undone. She had not spoken to the king in 5 days. Not since the feast that never happened. Not since the silence that wrapped around her like a second skin. He had not scolded her. He had not dismissed her. He had simply stepped back. A breath withheld. A page left unturned. A man deciding, quietly, whether he still wanted what he had once torn down a kingdom to obtain. The room around her was too clean, too still, too waiting. The fire had been lit, but it offered little warmth. The tapestries had been drawn, but the wind crept through anyway. Outside, the sky was bruised with the color of late winter, gray and unresolved. Anne folded her hands in her lap, her sleeves falling over her wrists like snow, and tried to recall the feeling of certainty, but it was gone. And in its place was something softer, something thinner, something that felt like fear, but older. Not the fear of punishment, but the fear of being forgotten. When she had stood in the kitchens, rolling dough with hands that trembled only when no one was looking, she had believed, foolishly, perhaps that if she could master the recipe, she could master the role, that if she could offer the king something he craved, something warm and sweet and wrapped in tradition, he might remember why he had chosen her. But men like Henry did not choose the same thing twice. They moved forward, hungry for new flavors, new triumphs, new heirs. And though she had given him a daughter with the fierce eyes of a queen and the stubborn heart of a soldier, she had not given him what he wanted most. Not a son, not security, not the thing he had broken a church to chase. The tarts cooled. The room did not. She stood, slowly, as if each step away from the bed might wake some part of her. She had tried to quiet. She walked to the table, looked down at the tray, and chose one of the surviving 4. She held it between her fingers, warm and delicate, its crust pale gold, its top dusted with sugar and regret. She took a bite, and the taste came rushing back, sharp lemon, creamy cheese, the faint sting of nutmeg. It was not the same as before. The sweetness did not land. The texture was wrong. Or perhaps it was her mouth that had changed. As she chewed, she thought of Catherine, not the cold, stiff figure seated by the window, but the girl she had once been told about, the Spanish princess who had ridden through the gates of England with stars sewn into her sleeves and Latin verses on her tongue, the young bride who had once laughed too loudly at banquets and prayed too quietly in her bed. Anne wondered, not for the first time, what had broken her, what silence had worn her down, what promise had turned to ash inside her chest, and whether this same path now stretched out before her, silent and golden, sweet at first, then bitter. She did not eat the rest of the tart. She set it down gently, as if it were a relic, not food, and she turned toward the mirror that hung across from the window. The woman staring back did not look ruined. Her eyes were sharp, her spine straight, but there was a faint smudge beneath one cheekbone where tears had dried too quickly, and her mouth held no curve, not smile, not frown, just a straight line drawn between triumph and exile. There was a knock, not hard, not urgent, but it landed like a stone in the stillness. Anne did not answer. The door creaked open anyway. A servant entered, young, pale, holding a folded note between two fingers, as if it might vanish if gripped too tightly. "From His Majesty," he said. She did not speak. She nodded once, and he placed the note on the table beside the tray. Then he left. As quietly as he had come, the door closed. Anne waited. Then she moved to the table, her hand brushing the edge of the parchment. The seal was already broken. It was not a letter. Not really. Just a message. A few words scrawled in haste. The king's handwriting, unmistakable, bold, slanted, impatient. "You will attend tonight. Wear the green." That was all. No greeting. No name. No warmth. Anne read it twice, then laid it flat on the table beside the half-eaten tart. Her fingers trembled, not with hope, but with the memory of what hope used to feel like. She looked again at the tray. Only 3 tarts remained untouched. One had been offered to the king. One she had eaten. Barely. And the others, they would cool. They would dry. They would be thrown out by morning. She turned toward the wardrobe, pulled open the heavy door, and reached for the green gown. The one he had once said made her look like summer before the storm. The one she had not worn since Elizabeth was born. She held it in her hands. The velvet still soft. The sleeves lined with silver thread. The bodice tighter than she remembered. It no longer smelled of perfume, only cedar and dust. She dressed slowly, carefully, as if it mattered, because it did. For tonight, at least, she would sit beside him. She would smile. She would raise her goblet. She would pretend that the sweetness still belonged to her, even if only 3 tarts remained. Even if the oven had grown cold. Even if no one remembered how the story had begun. Because that was the truth. No one liked to write down. The crown was not the reward. It was the test. And sweetness, no matter how carefully baked, never belonged to anyone for long. The sugar melted the moment it touched her tongue. It always did. Soft, fine, almost silent in its sweetness. It dissolved before it could be chewed, before it could be tasted fully, leaving behind only a suggestion of pleasure, a faint hum of something that might once have been joy. Anne Boleyn sat at the long, narrow table near the edge of the south hall, the green velvet gown pressed tight around her ribs, the silver thread biting into her sleeves with every movement. Her plate was half full, her cup untouched, and on the center of the gold-rimmed charger that had once been brought out only for queens, rested one single Maid of Honour tart. It was perfect in shape, glossy and still warm, its crust unbroken, its filling set just right. It had been placed before her without ceremony, without comment, as though it were nothing, as though it were just food. But Anne knew better. She had watched the way the servants had moved around her quickly, politely, and always with eyes averted. She had noticed how the other ladies had seated themselves a little further away than usual, their smiles stiff, their laughter thinner. She had counted the goblets of wine being poured and noticed that hers remained full, untouched, as if no one wished to risk a spill. And she had seen the king, sitting at the far end of the table, speaking to someone else, laughing too loudly, clapping a shoulder that was not hers. He had looked at her only once, and even then, it had not been a look, it had been a pause, a flicker, a moment of acknowledgement that passed too quickly to matter. Still, the tart remained in front of her. She lifted it now, slowly, as if it were made of glass, and took a small bite. The sugar melted as always. The cheese was soft, the lemon sharp. The pastry flaked with a tenderness that felt almost cruel. And as she chewed, her thoughts drifted back through kitchens and corridors, back through letters burned and gowns discarded, back to the first time she had offered him this very taste. When everything between them had still felt dangerous and new, she had been the only one who said no to him, the only one who refused to be touched until she wore a crown. And for a time, that defiance had made her powerful. For a time, it had turned her into something more than mistress, more than flirtation, more than passing whim. It had made her a challenge, and he had loved nothing more than to win. But now the crown sat heavier. It was not new anymore. It was not thrilling. It was only expected. It dug into her scalp when she bowed her head too long. It left a ring around her forehead when she took it off at night. It did not shine as it once did. Neither did she. The tart was gone now. Only crumbs on the plate. She wiped her fingers with the cloth napkin and looked up slowly, letting her gaze travel down the table, past the silver platters and the swans carved from marzipan, past the crystal decanters and wax-sealed jugs, until her eyes reached his Henry. Once her storm, once her fire, once her cause, now simply a man with a growing belly and a restless eye, chewing too loudly on meat that had cooled while he laughed at someone else's jest. He did not smile when their eyes met. He did not frown either. He only looked briefly, then turned away again. And in that small gesture, Anne felt something slide quietly into place inside her chest, like the last lock clicking shut on a door that would not open again. She reached for her goblet, not because she was thirsty, but because she needed something to hold. The metal felt cold in her palm. She raised it slowly, as if to toast. But no one was watching. No one raised their glass in return. The moment passed, unnoticed. Beside her, Lady Rochford whispered something to another maid. Anne caught only part of it, Catherine. And then laughter. But it was not her Catherine they meant. Not the exiled queen. No. It was the other one. The younger one. The soft-faced one who curtsied too deeply and giggled too easily. The one whose name no one dared say too loudly yet. Because no one wanted to admit that the page was already turning, that the king had begun to drift, that another woman now walked the garden paths he once shared with Anne, and that her name, Catherine Howard, had begun to fill the spaces Anne once believed were hers alone. She said nothing. She did not rise. She did not confront. She only sat, spine straight, eyes calm, lips resting against the rim of her cup. Because what could she say? She had once been the whisper. Now she was the silence. And silence, in the Tudor court, was not peace. It was prelude. The feast continued. Dishes were changed. Music was played. Musicians strummed lutes without looking up. Servants cleared platters and brought out sweets dusted in rose petals and shaped like hearts. But no one looked at Anne again. Not even the king. Especially not the king. When the last song ended, and the last candle guttered low, Anne rose alone. She did not wait to be dismissed. She did not speak to those seated beside her. She walked the length of the hall, the velvet of her gown dragging slightly behind her, like the tail of a vanishing comet. And when she reached the end, she did not look back. The corridor beyond was empty. The door to her chambers stood open. Inside, a single candle flickered on the table, and beside it, another tart, the last of the batch, wrapped in linen. Waiting, Anne unwrapped it slowly, fingers gentle, as if she were unfolding something sacred. She held it in her palm, its shape familiar, its scent unchanged. But she did not eat it. She simply looked at it, then set it down beside the candle, and blew out the flame. Darkness fell, and in that quiet blackness, she finally allowed herself to say the name, not aloud, but in her mind. Catherine. Not the first, not the last, just the next. And the sugar, untouched on the tart, glittered faintly in the dark, like stars that had already burned out before anyone noticed they were gone. Long after the fire had gone out, and long after the final tart had cooled untouched on its silver plate, there was a quiet that settled into the stone of the palace, like dust into forgotten corners. It was not the quiet of sleep or peace or rest. It was the quiet that comes when something has ended, but no one yet dares to say it aloud. It drifted down the corridors and across the tapestries, past the wax seals on letters that would never be answered, through the high windows of chambers where footsteps no longer paused, and into the small, shuttered room at the edge of the Queen's wing, where a name was still written on the door, though no one spoke it anymore. Anne Boleyn lay awake. She had not moved in hours. The fire in her chamber had died with the night, the last ember curling in on itself like the corner of a scorched page. Her hands rested on her stomach. Her hair spread across the pillow in dark waves. Her crown removed hours ago and placed carefully on the dressing table beside her comb and her sealed letter and the empty pewter dish where a tart had once been placed, but never eaten. It had been untouched. That last one, just as she had left it, there had been no appetite. Not anymore. Not when the king had begun to smile at someone else in the gardens. Not when the musicians had started playing songs. Anne did not request. Not when even the cooks no longer asked whether she preferred cloves or nutmeg in her tarts. She had once believed history would remember her hands, how they had signed decrees, how they had rested on the belly that carried Elizabeth, how they had sewn her own crest into her cloak, how they had held the pastry tray the night the king first asked what it was called. Maid of Honour, she had said then, and he had laughed and asked if she was offering him one. But now she knew better. History would not remember her hands. It would remember her fall. The execution date had not been named. Not yet. But Anne could feel it waiting, like a tide just beyond the shore. Silent and inevitable. The tower had already whispered her name through its walls. The scaffold had already been swept. The sword had already been chosen. She had seen it in their eyes. In Lady Rochford's silence. In Cranmer's hesitations. In the way the courtiers now bowed to her with mouths that no longer smiled. Even Elizabeth, sweet and silent in her cradle, had been taken away to a separate chamber. Too young to know what her mother was about to become, a name wrapped in shame. A woman made into warning. A tart no longer served. Anne rose slowly, as if the bed might protest, and crossed the floor barefoot. And the cold stone, a cruel reminder that warmth was no longer promised. She stood by the window, though the shutters were closed, and leaned her forehead against the wooden frame. Breathing in the scent of old wood and wax and time, she thought of her father, far away and silent. She thought of her sister, once so full of laughter, now tucked away in another man's household. She thought of Catherine of Aragon, who had faded with dignity, while the world whispered, and now, she thought of another Catherine, the new one, the girl whose cheeks were still pink from youth, who had not yet learned that the king's love was a feast with a bitter aftertaste. She did not hate her. She did not hate anyone. She only wished the world had room for more than one woman at a time. In the far corner of the room, the tart still rested on its plate. She had not touched it. She had not even looked at it. But now, she walked toward it slowly, sat down beside it, and let her eyes fall upon it round, golden, soft in the center. The sugar still clinging to its top, though. The heat had long since left. She picked it up with both hands. Not delicately. Not as a queen. But as a woman who had once been hungry. And then she set it back down. It would be the one they found beside her. Not a Bible. Not a letter. Not a ring. A tart. A reminder of what she had been. A whisper of what she had tried to offer. Not power. Not scandal. Not defiance. Just sweetness. She returned to the window. Dawn had not yet come. But she could sense it approaching. A thin line of silver pressing against the edges of the world. Waiting for permission to rise. When she closed her eyes, she did not dream of Henry. She dreamed of the kitchens, of the bowl of curds, of the scent of lemon, of a girl in a stained apron, laughing softly as she tried to cut pastry with the rim of a glass, of the queen sitting nearby, saying, "Only fill them halfway. Let them rise on their own." Of the moment she had first learned that the smallest things were often the most dangerous. She had once believed that if she could be sweet enough, he would never tire of her. But sweetness had never been meant to last. When they came for her the next morning, the chamber was still, and the tart untouched. She rose without protest. She dressed without help. She asked only that her hair be tied back with a ribbon, and that Elizabeth be kissed in her sleep. And when she stepped through the door and into the hall, she left behind the dish, the crown, the name that history would try to swallow whole. Anne, queen, mother, mistress, witch, but never baker. And the tart, left uneaten, cooled in the quiet. Its sweetness fading into the air like a name that had never truly been spoken.